joining us today. My name is Simran and I'm the founder of Power Women. An unprecedented humanitarian crisis is unfolding in India, and the last few weeks have been very difficult for many of our members. So, I do want to begin by saying that for those of you based out of India, you and your loved ones are in our thoughts and prayers. We would like to support our community during this difficult time of uncertainty and this difficult time of grief. If you feel you need someone during this time to talk to listen to, please do not hesitate to reach out to us. Drop us an email at hello@powerwomen.world, and we are happy to talk, listen, and do whatever little bit we can do. During these times of crisis, it's become even more important for us to reach out, to help, and to seek help. Empathy, mental health, and support groups will be needed for a long time to overcome the emotional crisis which this pandemic is going to leave behind. We started our personal advisory boards in January this year with the aim to support each other and to support the community in their professional and personal goals via peer-to-peer coaching. These boards are built around the concept of peer-to-peer coaching with women supporting each other. We spend time in our boards contracting with each other, evaluating and reevaluating our goals, supporting, coaching, and guiding each other. Many of us are looking at career transitions, thinking of following our true calling and passion. And as we work together in our boards, it's important that we are very well equipped to coach and support each other, especially around such times of crisis. Hence, I'm really looking forward to our conversation today and to hearing what our guest today has to say about his own coaching journey. Now, I remember having this conversation with him back in 2011 when I didn't know much about or didn't know anything about coaching. And I still recall how passionately he spoke about it even a decade before, and we know how much the world needs it today. So thank you, Parin Mehta, for joining us today. Parin Mehta is the Managing Director for Airbnb in Asia Pacific region. He's the former Head of Strategic Partnerships for Southeast Asia at Google. Parin has grown both small startups and large global sales organizations. He has worked in Singapore, California, and London. Parin was a management consultant and a teacher in rural Japan. I remember, I think you do speak Japanese. We can talk about it later. Parin continues to advise and coach several startups and entrepreneurs around the world. Parin has a BA from the University of Cambridge and an MBA from INSEAD. And in his spare time, he enjoys boxing, coaching, investing, and dressing up his baby son in silly costumes. Thank you for joining us, Parin. Really looking forward to this conversation. I also want to thank our two chairs today, two stellar ladies from our advisory board program. Firstly, Smita, who's joining us today from Bombay. Smita, thank you so much. Hard for me to comprehend what you've been going through over the last few weeks. Really, thank you for taking time out. And also, you were the first one who said that, we've been coaching each other in the advisory board. Do you think we could do some skill building around this? And that's what led me to reach out to Parin and to host this. So thank you for giving this, initiating this. And our second chair for today is Mrinalini Ramakrishnan, also a fellow INSEAD alum like Parin. And I felt that she and Parin had parallels. She also has a very successful career in private banking and feels very passionately about coaching people. And over my conversations in the last few weeks with Mrini, I've learned that she coaches a lot of people in her team and around her, and also her board members. So it was perfect to have the two of them lead the conversation today. Thank you. And Mrini, over to you.
Really, we've come together as a women who are keen to help each other and advise each other and guide each other, because sometimes it is a little bit lonely at the table. So here we are to support each other and network. However, I think this past year has been quite difficult. Many of us working from home for more than a year. We've not had the ability to be next to each other and network with each other. in today's world and in the last 12 months, what are the most useful tips you give to people who are working from home and struggling a little bit with um, navigating this new environment, to stay motivated, to have a work-life balance, to know that they can still continue achieving their dreams and aspirations?
Thanks, Mrin. Yeah, it's a great question. Where do you start? I think, well, first of all, I just have to echo what Simran said as well. For everyone who's in India, and it's a really difficult time. So thanks for joining. And I hope this is a bit of a mental relief for everyone who's doing that. Just to your question, I think probably the single biggest thing is just patience with ourselves and with each other. I think it's just something that probably everyone's learned, and it's one of those things that intuitively we probably all know, but to actually do it in the moment can be really, really difficult. Both kind of on ourselves, maybe with the people we spend most time with, maybe with the people we work with, and then it becomes even more complex, and the difficulty compounds trying to do it through Zoom, where there's a stat, right? When you're communicating, only 7% of the communication is words. The other 93% is visual cues or the in-person. So straight away, you've stripped out 9/10 of the communication. And in times of stress, cortisol levels are high. And so it's not really a great basis to communicate effectively. So I think that's the first thing, is just that awareness that it's difficult. It's difficult for different people at different times, depending on what they have going on. And it's unpredictable as well. And I think we've all seen this happen, where it feels like we're making progress on something, whether it's COVID or restrictions or vaccines, and then there's a setback, and so you kind of go 2 steps forward and 1 step back. So having that composure over a really, really long period of time is really draining, and it's really difficult. I was talking to my team in India today, actually, and I was saying that most challenges in life, whether it's relationship breakup or bereavement, it kind of, they say time is a healer and it gets better over time. But this thing is different. It's just got worse over time. Like, the situation in India is at the worst it's been since COVID began.
Mm-hmm.
And it's getting progressively worse. So, if I kind of summarize everything, I think the biggest thing is how do we all kind of build in some of that space between action and reaction? When we hear something or we get an input, how do we give ourselves a couple of seconds just to compose ourselves and think about what we're saying, and think about how it might be received by other people, and in many cases just almost really simplifying what we're trying to say and not trying to say too much. And then if you extend that even further, especially if you're in a leadership position of some description, whether it's in the workplace or in family or for friends or whatever it is how do you get to that place of just being a bit more inquisitive and a bit more thoughtful around what the other person might be experiencing, and getting more into that questioning and inquiry mode rather than the telling mode, which kind of tees up really nicely a discussion about coaching.
No, I think that's really a good pointer, to be patient. And I think that's more what each of us should learn to do. But when we are in a board, how can we then translate that to into an actionable for the people who are in our board? Is it more about telling them to take the time, write down things that mean something to them? What is it that's troubling them? How would you translate that patience that we must all be aware of into an actionable from us to do as a peer-to-peer coach?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is around creating the space for, firstly, space for people to have more than a surface level thought and to actually have some deeper introspection. And I think a lot of that is driven by great questions, right? And open-ended questions that really force someone to think a bit deeper and not get away with a surface level answer, I think is the first thing. And then I think the second thing is the space in terms of allowing people to kind of articulate their thoughts in the way that's most natural to them. So whether it's, for some people, it might be processing their thoughts by writing them. For others, it might be playing them back verbally to someone. For others, it might be going off for a walk and coming back 15 minutes later and kind of sharing what they're experiencing. And I think that can be quite difficult at the beginning when you don't know someone. You kind of have to, before you get to almost the coaching discussion, it's kind of like the hardware and software, right? You kind of need to figure out the other person's software. The software is the questions, but you need to figure out their hardware. Like, how are they wired? What are their communication preferences? How do they tend to operate under stress? And then only when you've got that, you can then start to think, you can start to say, okay, what's the best way for me to help this person really do some deep introspection and really think or process what they're trying to do at this point.
Okay, so would you say that the way you coach someone would be very different from how you coach another person based on how they receive that coaching? And I think that's quite interesting, because even in our boards, we can see that everybody receives information in a different way. So if I were then to take a step back and say, what is the difference between a coach, a mentor, maybe a therapist? What is the difference?
Yeah, I'll focus more on coaching and mentoring because I know a bit more about that. I don't know too much about therapy, but the way I kind of summarize it is mentoring is more of a telling relationship. So it might be someone saying, how do I negotiate this salary increase? And the mentor would specifically say, to do problem statement X, you do action Y and Z. Coaching is a bit more around questioning and basing it on the hypothesis that the person probably knows the way forward, but they just need a bit of help structuring their thoughts and articulating them in a way that leads to action. And it can often be a bit more goal focused or a bit more problem statement focused as well. And really the most effective coaches, all they're doing is they're just holding up a mirror for the other person to play back to themselves and really start to process what their thoughts are and turn it into something actionable. So I guess, to summarize that, I think certainly the best coaches I've worked with are ones who know what question to ask at the right time and know how to just prompt a slightly deeper level of thinking and a very surface level answer. And I think, we were talking just before call, but I think they're ones that can force a degree of accountability on the person as well, so that they are able to do what they are saying they want to do.
Right. No, that's interesting. So do you think that it matters that you have relevant work experience, a sector experience to be a good coach? Or given that we are all from different sectors and industries in our advisory boards, can we still be good coaches to each other?
Yeah, I think it's possible. I mean, there's different schools of thought on this, but I would say generally on the mentoring side, because it is telling, you would expect the mentor to have some form of domain expertise in the area that it's problem. So if I was suddenly deciding I wanted to become a doctor, I would probably go and seek a mentor who has been a doctor or has been through the experience of a doctor. I think for coaching, it is a little bit different because it is asking. And I think also when the person doesn't have domain expertise, they can ask purer and better structured questions because they're not transposing what they think. They're actually asking purer questions because they don't have the domain expertise to go on to. So I'll give you an example. I tend to spend, over the last 3 or 4 years at least, I've pivoted a lot of my coaching to first-time founders in Southeast Asia. And I've not been a founder. I've not launched a significant company. So I don't have the experience of doing what they're typically trying to solve for. And in many ways, they find that beneficial because the questions I can ask are, in many ways, they're much simpler and they're not loaded with an intention from my side. They are purely focused on helping them deconstruct their thoughts and turn them into something actionable. Whereas I find in the coaching interactions where it might be with someone who has a problem statement in an area that I have experience in, there tends to be some bias that creeps into the questions. And look, it's human nature, right? We all, by default, if you're the kind of person who enjoys coaching, you're probably the kind of person who enjoys helping people. And so it's very difficult to resist that temptation to go into telling mode and say, like, in your head, you're having a dialogue that says, like, I know specifically what you should do, like, and you're kind of holding back.
You hold back, yeah.
And I think we've probably all experienced that. And so one way to get around that is to really focus your coaching on people who have a different background to you or a different perspective or have had a different set of experiences, because then that really does help you really stay a bit more focused on that art of asking the right question rather than kind of telling based on your experience.
And what is that? What are those? I mean, I understand they need to be open-ended questions. They need to help the person be a little bit more introspective. Are there a list of, easy questions that we should all be asking? Or is it just very much based on trying to have a conversation and make them think about different aspects of the problem that they're trying to solve. Do you have any tips around those?
Yes, great question. I really think it depends on individual style. There are some coaching models out there that, if you are relatively new to coaching, you could pick up fairly easily and use as a structure. So one of the ones I really like is called the Grow model, which you can look up. Some of you might be familiar with it. But that just gives you a good structure to at least ensure that the coaching discussion ends with something actionable. But it really depends on the level of relationship you have with the coachee. I find that for maybe the first or second session with someone, I might try and adopt a bit more of that formal structure. But by the 10th session, I might actually get to a point where I'm trying to get them to talk as much as possible and really don't need to use too many open-ended questions. Yeah, or even model. One question might be, tell me more, or can you explain that in a bit more detail, or can you help me understand that from this person's perspective? So there can be really, really simple prompts that just force a bit more of a deeper reflection.
Right. No, that's useful. So many of us have returned to the workplace after a career break. And, there is a bit of confidence building that is required to ensure that we know that we actually can contribute in the workplace, or we can actually step up to where we need to be, given the changes in the industry, etc. In your experience, is there anything that we can do better as peers to motivate, to encourage, to egg people on in that direction? Any tips?
Yeah, it's a great question. I found the times where it's most effective is where someone is intrinsically motivated, right? So the motivation is coming from within them. And where the coach can be helpful is just to help try and get some of that intrinsic motivation to be a bit more focused on a specific outcome or a specific goal. Where I found it to be really difficult is where someone is not intrinsically motivated to do the thing they're saying, and you can actually identify that pretty quickly, right? Maybe you've all had scenarios where someone said, "Okay, well, this is the thing I want to do," and within 2 or 3 questions, you start thinking in your head, "I don't think you actually want to do that. It doesn't really sound like you really want to do what you're saying."
And do you say that? Do you say that to your coachee? We're like, "Are you sure you want to do that?"
But I wouldn't say. I'd maybe phrase it a bit differently. I would maybe, rather than say, "Are you sure you want to do that?" I would maybe ask something like, "How might you identify whether this is what you really think, or what would this look like if you didn't want to take this approach?" And so you really want to kind of force some of that accountability on that person to get to that destination mentally, rather than you prompting them too much.
Okay. And on the other side, you've got, it's very, very common, especially amongst women, to have the imposter syndrome, right?
And men as well. I don't think it's unique to women.
But okay, fine. And so invariably, there's this big job out there, and you would love to go for it, but you're not sure if you have every qualification that is in the job spec to go for it. I think that's something that we all can easily help each other and motivate each other in coaching them to get themselves mentally prepared to apply if that's something they want to. Is that something you see often, and what tips do you have for us to egg each other on?
Yeah, I think I think imposter syndrome is its own body of study, and I think there's quite a lot of study. But I think just generally, really good questions can be used to build momentum and build confidence. And a lot of it is through helping a person either, 1, feel assured about their abilities, or 2, just almost reminded of their capability, and 3, their motivation. And so there is a way that you could potentially ask someone questions that helps them remind themselves why they are in fact qualified for this thing, or helps them maybe confront what it might be that is holding them back. And so it really depends on the individual, but I think once you start to do this a few times with maybe the same people, you can start to identify things, and you can start to hone in on really the right question to ask, to then figure out what the real barrier is.
Right. No. So going on to that with coaching, I guess, is there a good time to start looking for a coach? Is it better? Do you find that middle management require coaching more, or is it senior management, or would you start coaching someone who's just out of, business school or graduate school? Is it something that comes with experience, i.e., is someone ready to receive coaching at a certain point in their career or life?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the best coaches are probably children, because they ask the simplest questions and they ask purest form of questions, right? Because they're not loaded with bias. So I think on the actual coach side, I think the prerequisites are a deep interest in human behavior and curiosity about the other person and the ability to succinctly ask great questions. On the coachee side, it's kind of a mirror image. Like it has to be anyone who's wanting to be coached has to be open-minded enough to be coached and to have to potentially confront some difficult truths about themselves, and they have to be they have to have some form of a growth mindset, right, by default. And it's something that comes up quite a lot is, coaches, you might take on an engagement where there just isn't the right chemistry or there isn't an aligned motivation, and it just doesn't make sense to continue that relationship. And I've certainly had a couple of those where, someone has said to me, okay, I want coaching. We've had about a 15-minute chat, and I've had to say, look, I don't think we're the right fit. This isn't going to work. I don't think I'm going to be able to give you what you're looking for. And that's fine. I think it's perfectly reasonable to do that. But in terms of a stage of life, a stage of career, I don't think there's a specific one. I think a lot of people have their first interaction with coaching at a period of transition, because that's a very natural time where we're looking for some input from an external party. So typically the people I see who really embrace coaching as coachees have typically picked it up at a period of transition in their life.
So now I'll go to you, Parin. Tell us a little bit about your coaching journey. What made you move into coaching? And I know you're working in a corporate job, but you're also coaching. So tell us about how that works and what motivated you to go into it.
Yeah, sure. I've always been curious about people, for sure. And I've always been interested in how different people behave in different situations. I didn't really know this. Like, it's not normal to know this about yourself when you're young. But I think in hindsight, it's always been there. And I think the time where it became really relevant to me was when I first started leading teams, and just felt really lost. Like there wasn't really a great introduction on how to lead teams. I think maybe a lot of people experience this, but you have a good experience as an individual contributor. And typically in big companies, the way they reward great individual contributors is to suddenly get them to lead a team. And it's like, well, that doesn't really make any logical sense. Like, why is it that a great individual contributor suddenly becomes a great people manager? I think they're two very distinct skills. And so for me, I got myself into that situation and thought, I'm really ill-equipped to do this. I have no idea what I'm doing. And tried to seek help and tried to seek some guidance from other people. And some of that was in the form of mentoring, but some of it I also was introduced to in the form of coaching. And I just found it really, really effective. And I thought that's such a great gift to be able to give someone, to be able to help someone do this and figure things out about themselves. And so I just became fairly curious about it, and then started also applying it myself in leading teams. And then over years, you just start to lead more complex teams. Maybe they're more geographically distributed, bigger in size, different levels, etc. And so it's actually just become a really important part of how I personally lead and work. And it's just an approach I tend to take with people I work with, which is much more of a coaching style than a directing style. And I think it's become, certainly in the last couple of jobs I've had, it's become really important because some of the teams I lead, the people are, well, firstly, they're way more capable than I am, and they have an expertise that I simply don't have. So, to give you an example right now, I lead a team across Asia. So, I don't know much about Korea, I don't know much about Thailand, but there's people on the team who really do. And so I'm not particularly valuable if I'm directing those teams and telling them what to do, but I can be useful if I'm coaching and helping them really get to where they want to be based on the knowledge they have. And so it's just kind of compounded over time where I've personally found it useful, and then I've personally benefited from being coached. And that just creates this really great flywheel of you're benefiting from it yourself, and you're benefiting from providing it to other people, and you enjoy doing it. And so that's really the dream, right? Something that people need, you enjoy, and you find it rewarding is kind of what we're all aspiring for.
No, and that's phenomenal. That's a great tidbit, because I think as we lead teams and you get bigger teams under your belt, you're not going to have that time to focus on the nitty-gritty of the day job, right? It's more about helping people solve their own problems by asking them the right questions to help them think through that problem. So I think that's a great tip. I'm looking at the time, and I believe it's time for me to open up the floor to Q&A and pass the baton over to Smita to see if there are any questions in the audience. Smita, over to you.
Thanks, Mrim. Hi, everyone. I think if you have any questions, please unmute yourself and feel free to ask the questions.
Hi, Parin. I'm Gayatri here. So what will be your first few steps for the first-time coach and mentor who is stepping into a global pace, that completely in a different geography, you get a mentee or a coachee? So how to kick on that conversation so that we can nurture that relationship further ahead?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thanks, Gayatri. I think probably the most important thing is trying to figure out what the goal is of that person. Like, why are they seeking out coaching or mentoring? Is it a specific goal or outcome or problem statement they have in their mind? Because I think that then tells you a lot of things. It tells you, well, first of all, it tells you what they're looking for, like how you can be useful, which is probably the most important part. But it also starts to give you an indication of how complex the problem is, and maybe the level of depth or introspection that you need to help get to in order to solve it. And then I think it's also just helpful to ask some, especially when you're coaching someone who's their experiences are maybe in a different context to yours. I think it's worth just asking some of those questions, like, what's your communication style? How do you prefer to be asked questions? How do you, do you tend to listen more or talk more? How do you process information? Just things like that, because then that can give you quite a few signals on how you can potentially be effective. And it also just allows you to pivot your style a little bit in a way that would be more helpful to.
Thanks, Parin. Definitely, yes. That give me the lead. Like, first is the goal part we can understand, and the few sessions it will go ahead. But definitely, as you touched upon, understanding the communication style or how their day or the work goes. So where additionally we can help, be it even two-way. Definitely,
yeah,
that helps. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just going to type it now, but the GROW model, if you look that up, it's a really great place to start, because it just allows you to follow a structure.
Yeah.
Any other question? Anyone wants to unmute yourself and ask?
Hi, Parin. I've got a question, if that's okay, Smita. So, you were saying you have a team in India, and right now there's a crisis going on. I know you're going to approach this in a minute, but how do you make yourself available to any issues they may have or what they're going through? Because I find it's quite difficult to poke my nose. I feel like I'm poking my nose into somebody's business, but at the same time, you want to reach out and lend support. What sort of questions do you use in that scenario?
Yeah, well, I mean, what a great question. And, I might not be as eloquent here because I'm literally learning this in real time as well this week. But I think, a lot of us have a tendency to, and it's human nature, is we sometimes listen to try and problem solve rather than just to listen. And personally, I'm finding at the moment that many people, the thing that's most useful to them in a crisis is just to have someone listen for the pure act of listening, not to provide a solution or not to provide a judgment, but just to be someone that can be a receptor of their thoughts and their stream of consciousness. And so I think a lot of it depends obviously on the level of trust, the relationship that you have with the person. But I think the first thing is just showing that you're available to listen. I think it is really, really powerful. And not necessarily just for problem solving, but just to say, if you want to talk, vent, or just articulate how you're feeling, let's have a discussion. But I think also it can sometimes be so open-ended that it's actually just easier to avoid for people. And so that's when, really depending on the strength of the relationship you have and the level of trust that's already there, you can start to ask specific questions like, how are you looking after yourself at this time? Or do you feel like things are getting progressively better or worse? And sometimes questions like that can just get someone talking a little bit. And then when someone is talking a little bit, they might start to open up a bit more. And then you can really start to identify serious issues that they face or opportunities where you could be helpful. It's very difficult. It's really difficult because people are, like we said at the beginning, the high stress situations where people's amygdalas are highly reactive and there's high levels of cortisol mean that it can be difficult just for people to articulate their thoughts and how they're feeling and process how they're feeling about things. And so it is pretty challenging.
No, thank you. I think there were two quite useful ways of starting a conversation in that direction without being too personal. Thank you. Great.
Hi, Parin.
Any other questions?
Yeah, this is Deepa Desai.
Yeah.
First, maybe just a comment. Thanks. I think the one good thing that I took from your earlier conversation was to have a space between action and reaction. That's wonderfully put. So give pause and then kind of react. And the other is a question. I've always heard that being a mentor or a coach always benefits and you learn from it. So, what has been your aha moment as a coach?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I sometimes joke with people after a coaching session that I probably got more out of it than they did. And
All right.
Certainly one of the aha moments for me is each individual is different. It sounds like a really obvious thing to say, but each individual is different and wired differently based on the set of experiences they've had, context they've had, and their entire existence. So it's really not helpful to use a just standard kind of boilerplate approach to every conversation. You have to really tailor it to the individual. And the reason this is an aha moment for me is because it's also just helped me when I'm being coached to really be clear with the coach what I'm looking for and how I think they can be helpful. And so it kind of it drives one another, because then when I'm being coached, I'm able to clearly articulate what I need from the person. And so it's probably a better coaching experience, which then makes me a more effective coach the next time. And so it just that kind of flywheel drives itself, which is really, really helpful. So yeah, I think that's probably the biggest thing is just recognizing that different people need very different things at different times. And it's really hard to know that up front. You kind of have to ask us some really good questions to start to figure that out.
Brilliant. Thanks so much.
Sure.
Can I ask another question then, Parin? There is always this difference between a professional coach and a life coach. And I feel like in our personal advisory boards, we are a combination of the two, because we also bring to the table the other things going on in life. And I think in the current environment that we are in, there's a lot of personal noise and balls that we're all juggling. What is the difference? And do you actually define yourself as a professional coach, a life coach, or does it all just weave into each other?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know what the official answer is on this. I think your point is right that people used to talk about this. You have your professional self and your personal self, and we just all know over the last 12 months that is simply not true. Like, it's impossible, because we all have different dimensions to our lives, right? Whether we're working, or we might be a parent, we might have parents ourselves, or other people we're responsible for. We might be a spouse. We have different roles that we play in our lives. And when you are working from home and not having different physical spaces to do all those different roles, it's difficult to pull them apart. And so what I typically tend to find, especially with the founders that I coach, is often the thing that they say is the problem isn't actually the problem. There's another underlying problem. And it gets very difficult to separate that kind of this idea of a work persona and a personal persona. So yeah, I think they're interspersed. I think they've become more interspersed than ever during COVID because we've been forced to. But in terms of the different types of coaching, I don't know what the official definitions are, but certainly the area where I've tended to focus is more on the what's called executive coaching. So it really is around solving for business problems or matters related to growing an enterprise. But you do find that some of those issues do actually become issues related to the personal life. So to give you an example, if someone is having trouble hiring or retaining executives, then there's probably an underlying EQ issue somewhere there.
Right.
And so there's a interpersonal issues that are going on that are related to someone's emotional intelligence, then that obviously stems into other parts of who they are. So you tend to find these things are pretty interconnected.
Just another follow-on question I think is important in this COVID environment. I think mental health and well-being is a very relevant topic, and it's come to light over the last 12 months. A lot of people who didn't cope very well working from home and not having these boundaries. I think when you're professionally coaching them, I've had people say that they're just not feeling the same as they normally do. At that point, what is it that we can do as people on the personal advisory board to kind of maybe steer them to seeking outside help or doing things to help with that situation, because that could be the crux of the problem and not being able to cope with work?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think that's one of the things is there is a certain point where coaching ends and more professional help is required. And I think that's one of the things you have to be really honest with yourself about is what are the realms of coaching. And that just goes back to my previous question around the previous question around executive coaching and life coaching or whatever the different versions are. But I think it's really important to know the boundaries of your area of expertise and not mislead someone. And so typically my personal style is I tend to be quite risk averse about this. And I will say to someone, look, this is outside the area of where I think I could be useful. And it probably makes sense for you to consult some professional help here, rather than try and use a coaching approach for problems that you're maybe not equipped to really help deal with.
Thank you.
Parin, I do have a question. When you look back at your career as a coach or your journey as a coach, and you reflect back, anything would you like to share? What is the advice you will give, which is like the do's and don'ts kind of thing, when you look back from your own experience?
Yeah, I think the first thing is you can't really fake this. Like you have to really genuinely be interested in people. And so I don't think everyone can be a coach, because you generally have to be curious about people and how they behave. And that's just not for everyone, which is fine. Not everyone has to be a coach. I think that's probably the first thing. And then I think the second thing is, well, maybe I'd frame it another way, which is maybe some mistakes I made, which is sometimes trying to rush to problem-solving mode rather than understanding mode. And I think it's, as you get more experience as a coach and you tend to become a bit more composed, because you have a large data set to look at of your experience to know what's useful. And so I think certainly an evolution I've had to go through is just taking the extra time on that listing and understanding the problem phase and not rushing to solution. So if you actually use the GROW model, this would be spending a bit more time on the G and the R, which is the goal and the reality, and not rushing to option too quickly. Because then what you can do is you can end up going down a narrow path and solving the wrong problem. And that's not particularly helpful for anyone. So yeah, I think that's probably the biggest thing, is just being a bit more, it all goes back to patience, right? And composure.
Okay, I think the follow-on question of that, given your experience being a great coach, what do you think are the kind of qualities, if you have to call out, that should I mean, being a good listener and some of those aspects, which are like essential, you know, like you mentioned, genuinely being interested in people, that's of course given. It can't be, you have to do it because you have to do it. So what do you think are the top couple of qualities that anybody should possess when they are trying to groom themselves as a good coach?
Yeah, I think the first one is curiosity, because it is all about questions, right? So that has to be driven by curiosity. I think the second one is the ability to listen, to truly listen, and not listen just to respond, but listen to actually understand what's going on. I think those are two very important things. And then I think the third one is around kind of like patience and composure, and not trying to rush conversations that maybe don't need to be rushed or could be taken over a long period of time. Because that's the other thing, you might meet someone on Monday and then you might meet them again on Thursday and they might be in a completely different mindset. And if 100% of your data set was the Monday, you would potentially, that conversation would lead to a different outcome to the one that's an average of Monday and Thursday, or Monday, Thursday, and the following Monday. So I think it's quite important to try and stress test some of your assumptions by really speaking with someone in different circumstances. And I think that's really critical right now. And I've seen it even this week where in periods of stress, someone's well-being can change hour to hour or day to day. And so it's quite useful to have a series of conversations, and that requires some patience.
Sure, thanks. I do have one question from the chat box. How does it vary? How does coaching vary across cultures, especially most of us lead, cross-cultural teams. So what are your thoughts or experience around that? You did share some facets about it in the beginning, but any suggestions, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, there's probably kind of academic literature on this that's probably worth reading, which is much better qualified than I am to speak on this. But personally, some things I found is, the act of questioning rather than telling means that you can kind of debase the cultural aspect pretty quickly, because you're not actually saying anything. You are forcing just introspection and reflection. And so I'm not sure if, certainly from a coaching perspective, whether different cultural contexts have a big impact. Probably from a mentoring thing they do. I mean, just a very basic one on mentoring is, in some cultures, you will have people who have a tough time being mentored by someone younger than them. Like, they just find it just repulsive, the idea of it. And that's just the cultural context that they've been experiencing and brought up in, and it's difficult to change that. So I think on mentoring, it's a bit more challenging, but on coaching, where it's open-ended questions and the coach isn't necessarily coming from a position of expertise other than being good at the art of coaching, I think the cultural nuances matter a bit less.
Yeah. So I think what we'll do is we'll take our poll to see see what our learning has been from this. I mean, I know, Parin, you've already said that to be a good coach, some of the key things that you can do is truly listen, to be curious, to be patient. But just before we go into mentoring meeting, can I quickly ask you, if I'm sitting with my board of really wonderful women, the 4, 5, 6 of us, what should I avoid? They're coming with their aspirations, with their goals, and generally they come because they're at a crossroads, there's an obstacle. What should I be careful of? Do you have any? I just, it's all, I think it's great to have positive things to do, but what should we make sure that we aren't doing, if there is anything that comes to mind?
Yeah, I think there's one like very obvious hazard, which I'll talk about, and there's one that's not so obvious. I think the one very obvious hazard is you want to get to a point where there's some psychological safety and someone is able to talk freely and not feel judged effectively, right? At least at the beginning, where you're still establishing connection. So I think that's something that's really critical, because if a person feels threatened or belittled in the first minute of a coaching discussion, it's just not going to be productive for anyone. So I think that's a very obvious one. I think the less obvious one though is the risk of kind of mentoring someone by mistake rather than coaching them. And what I mean by that is leading them down a path towards an outcome that's biased by your experience as the coach, and almost kind of asking leading questions, or I don't know what it's a closed question. I don't know what the opposite is to open-ended questions. Because you're essentially leading someone down a very narrow path there, rather than encouraging them to be open-minded and exploratory. And I think that's the risk that people often don't see. And the reason they don't see it is it kind of feels quite good, because they're like, oh, I helped this person, I did a great job, well done me. And the person's like, oh, I got a solution, like great. But actually, if you went back and reflected on that, it wasn't really a coaching discussion. It was a mentoring discussion that was led by the biases of the coach and the coachee, which doesn't feel particularly dangerous at the time, but might be somewhat.
Thank you so much, Parin, for your time.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. And yeah, please, for anyone who's in India, please just do take care. Really thinking of you.